Hello friends, welcome to UGC EPG Pathshala. I am Dr. Jaideep Sharangi, Associate Professor, Department of English, Jogesh Chandra Chaudhary College, University of Calcutta, Kolkata. We are into Module 34. This is about the Elizabethan stage and the rise of William Shakespeare. This module is written by Dr. Wendrila Ghosh, Nabobaliganj Mahavidyalaya, Kosba, Kolkata. In this module, we are going to learn how the Elizabethan stage was formed, how the drama shaped into the early part of the Elizabethan period. Our special focus is on the Elizabethan stage mechanism and the rise of drama until Shakespeare. And in the last part, we are also talk about the early drama in the hands of William Shakespeare. So, as we go along in this particular age, we are to embrace the development of drama and theatre as well as stage during the early part of the Elizabethan age, and we will also focus on contribution of Shakespearean plays during his early days. We conceptualize this particular phase of history of English literature from 1558 to 1590. We trace out the development of theatre and performance and development of stage in the hands of university wits in pre-Shakespearean time and early part of Shakespearean dramatic career. Friends, just see the Elizabethan stage on the screen. This is the stage audience performance in an Elizabethan stage. The influence of the medieval drama, and there are three categories we are to discuss. Number one, mystery and morality plays. This is a high serious plays mixing up with low comedy. Then the second part is of course folk plays, where the pagan remnants, the fairies and the sprites and the feast of foods. And the third is interludes. Interludes are in between or links between two plays. The humanistic debates, the influence of Seneca and the influence of Plautus. Friends, there are three notable types of theatre houses during the early part of the Elizabethan period. Number one, private theatre. Small roofed buildings for the wealthy audience, and in private theatre houses no common people was allowed. The public, usually impoverished, in the backwards of inns. So there was zonal division for the private and the public. And the notable theatre houses of this age we must note. Number one, the Rose. Number two, the Swan. Number three, the Globe. And number four, the Fortune. And here are some drawings you can easily associate with. Look at the structure of one particular Elizabethan public theatre house. I think you can easily understand the gallery part, the pit, the trap door, all are identified in this picture. The public theatres were either a round, square or octagonal with wooden structure which consisted with unroofed courtyards, roofed galleries, then the pits, the courtyard discovery space, hut and the trap door, and look into the best of this theatre, where you will find where the spectators seat. University wits, early Elizabethan drama. It is unwise if we introduce William Shakespeare without introducing university wits. University wits were university graduates, and they are noted for their contribution to early Elizabethan stage productions. In this we may mention names like Christopher Marlowe, George Peele, Thomas Lodge, Thomas Nash, Robert Greene, John Lilly. John Lilly, 1554 to 1606, wrote courtly plays for companies of child actors. His plots moved around elegant debates, and he is famous for euphemistic language. He wrote some of the immortal plays. Then Robert Greene, best known as Shakespearean critic, contributed a lot to the pre-Shakespearean drama. Similarly, George Peele and Thomas Lodge. But the most important person among the university wits was Christopher Marlowe, 1564 to 1593. Marlowe's tragedies include Tamburlaine, Dido Queen Carthages, Dr. Faustus, Edward II, Massacre at Paris, and Jew of Malta. Remember, Christopher Marlowe was the first person who incorporated comic relief in a tragic spectacle. His Dr. Faustus is often been criticized is a departure from the traditional plays. Like, according to Aristotle, tragedy should have a good beginning, middle, and end. Dr. Faustus is often been criticized as a play with perfect beginning and end, but in the middle we have some gross element. His important tragedy, Jew of Malta, where the Barabbas has been presented as an important character and moneylender. Tamburlaine aspires for world conquering the world. So his characters are the children or the fruits of the Renaissance. They burn with Renaissance temper or sentiments to conquer the world, or in respect of money, power, and activities. His Dr. Faustus celebrates the sentiments of the Renaissance. Earliest plays of the Elizabethan age. The first comedy of the Elizabethan age is attributed to Ralph Royster by Nicholas Adil in the year 1552. And friends, possibly you know the first tragedy in English written by Thomas Norton and Thomas Sackville, and the title of the play is Gorboduc. 1561 is often been cited as the first tragedy written in the name of Gorboduc in blank verse. It is also the first play in blank verse. It was performed for Queen Elizabeth in the year 1562. Now, friends, possibly you must be wondering what are the acting companies of the then time. 1590 to 1642, approximately 20 companies of actors in London. More than 100 provincial troupes. Companies usually played in London in the winter, spring, and the travel in many ways. The Elizabethan acting companies are Number 1, Lady Elizabeth's Men. Number 2, Leicester's Men. Number 3, Lord Strange's Men. Number 4, Pembroke's Men. Number 5, Worcester's Men. Worcester's Men, William Somerset, 3rd Earl of Worcester. Lord Chamberlain's Men, the patronage of Lord Strange Pattern, who died in 1594. The players found a patron in Henry Carey, the Lord Chamberlain, performed at the theatre and the Curtain Playhouse. 1599, moved to the newly built Globe Theatre House. By 1600, they had emerged as the leading theatrical company in London. 1603, they became the King's Men under royal patent from the James I. The company continued successfully until the Puritans closed theatre houses in the year 1642. Now remember, boy actors on Elizabethan stage. I hope everyone who is listening to us today everyone is aware of the fact that women were not allowed on the Elizabethan stage during Shakespeare's time. The parts of women were enacted by child actors, boys whose voice had not yet changed. Whole acting companies were created with child performers. The children of the Chapel Royal and the St. Paul's Boys, the children's companies played a regulatory part in court. The Puritans, who disapproved the theatre in general, were particularly scandalized by boys cross-dressing as women, which they felt would give rise to sexual and moral perversions detrimental to the then society. Friends, let's talk about censorship. The Puritan leaders of the City of London disapproved the theatres for their immorality. The Privy Council was wary of the political comment often present in topical plays. Censorship under the direction of the Master of Revels was very strict. In the year 1596, the City Corporation ordered the expulsion of players from London and the closing of the inn theatres. Theatres moved across the river to the south bank. Edmund Tilney, Master of Revels. Now everyone knows the Globe Theatre. Globe Theatre, I think you can all see the picture of Globe Theatre, built by the James Burbage, and James Burbage's son in the year 1598 for the Lord Chamberlain's Men. It got completely burned down by a fire in the year 1613, and it was during the production of Henry VIII, rebuilt in the year 1614 and continued as the leading playhouse of London until 1642. And you know what happened in 1642 when the Puritans shut down all theatre houses. Now we switch over to the contribution of William Shakespeare, and in this module we will only study the first half of Shakespeare's contribution till 1590, but his literary career continued till 1616. Let us discuss some facts about William Shakespeare. He was the son of John and Mary Shakespeare, born in the year 1564 and died in the year 1616. He went to school at the King's New School in Stratford, married Anne, and he became a very prominent writer later on. And during his literary career, he also contributed to the performance of Ben Jonson's plays. He became an actor and later on became a writer. His early plays, by early plays means before 1590, are Titus Andronicus, Two Gentlemen of Verona, Taming of the Shrew, and Henry VI, Part 1. By this, we can say, if we just sketch Shakespeare's early plays, we can only trace that Shakespeare has potential in the coming 2 decades or so, where he will be established as the most prolific writer of comedies, tragedies, and tragicomedies in the days to come. But we should not forget the contribution of university wits before Shakespeare came into being. Christopher Marlowe, Peele, Lilly, and all contributed and paved the way for William Shakespeare. In this module 34, we try to encapsulate our ideas on the development of theatre, stage, houses in pre-Shakespearean time. We try to embrace our ideas on the influence of medieval dramatic tradition on early Shakespearean playwrights. We also discussed at length on the university wits and their contribution. We concentrated on the theatre houses, different categories of theatre houses during that time, and we focused on the role of Globe Theatre, public theatre, and the private theatre houses during pre-Shakespearean age. We concluded our module with references to early Shakespearean works till 1590 AD. Hello friends. For this particular module, those who are advanced learners can refer to Arthur F. Kinley, A Companion to Renaissance Drama, Oxford publication. Number 2, Edward Dowden, Shakespeare, A Critical Study of His Mind and Art, Atlantic Publishers. Then Arthur Kinney, A Companion to Renaissance Drama, and Andrew Gurr, Playgoing in Shakespeare's London, Cambridge University Press. These are important reference texts for your further knowledge. Now let's watch audio visual on public theatre houses.
Elizabethan England saw the first permanent theatre structures in England's history. The plays that were performed in England previous to this were done in temporary outdoor structures or in buildings that were used for purposes other than theatre. There were plays and other entertainments done at court, but if a theatre company wanted to make a living at theatre, they had to travel from one makeshift stage to another. It wasn't until a man who was both an actor and a carpenter by the name of James Burbage undertook to create a permanent structure for the performing of plays in 1576 that England had a theatre for play production. The name of the first theatre of England was aptly called the Theatre. Burbage leased a plot of land just outside the city limits and undertook to create a structure that would be large enough to hold many paying ticket holders and to accommodate a stage on which plays would be presented. Burbage had to create a building that could control the patrons as they entered to see the play. His theatre was a business, and he was trying to come up with a simple structure that would make money. Since there was no existing theatre to use as a model, Burbage put together a theatre structure based on several other buildings and architectural arrangements that accommodated similar entertainments. Burbage's theater plan was soon adopted by many other theater companies and stood as the basis for theater throughout the Elizabethan period. From surviving records, we know that the theater was a simple wood structure that was polygonal in shape. There was no roof on this theater, so there was no need to devise a way to light the play productions that were performed there. Inside the theater, there were galleries that rose up perhaps 2 levels high. In these galleries were benches or seats where patrons could pay a little higher ticket price to view the action from above the stage. To utilize as much of the interior of the theater as possible, Burbage also sold tickets to the pit area below the stage. The pit was a dirt floor that surrounded the stage on 3 sides. In this sense, it was the first thrust theater space. In the pit, patrons, known as groundlings, would stand to view the play production. The price of admission into this area was only a penny. The theater was the model for what became known as the public playhouses. These theaters were called public playhouses due to the fact that they were intended for the general public. Plays were performed in the afternoon, as the only source of lights for these productions was the sun. Here is a drawing of the only existing drawn image of a public theater that was actually rendering during the Elizabethan period. All other images of public theaters of this period are conjectural drawings based on records that were passed down. This drawing was done by a Dutch traveler who sent back this picture of the Swan Theater in a letter to his home. There were 3 major influences which led to the physical structure of the public playhouses. Those were gaming arenas, inns of court, and medieval staging practices. The location for popular pastimes in Elizabethan England were the gaming arenas. These were wooden structures of a polygonal shape that, with raised seating and a pit with dirt floor, bear baiting and bull baiting took place. In its best-known form, arenas for this purpose were called gaming arenas, or bear gardens. These polygonal-shaped structures consisted of a circular, high fenced area called the pit and raised seating for the spectators. A post would be set in the ground toward the edge of the pit and a bear chained to it, either by the leg or neck. A number of well-trained hunting dogs would be set on the bear, being replaced as they were tired, wounded, or killed. It is generally believed that Burbage designed his polygonal-shaped theater based on these gaming arenas. The Inns of Court of Elizabethan England were training centers for barristers. The early Inns of Court were 2 to 3 stories high, with a courtyard built in the center. There were galleries which extended over the courtyard. Plays were often performed in these courtyards on makeshift stages. Those in attendance would stand in the galleries above the stage to view the action of the play. Burbage, no doubt, performed plays in this setting and saw the advantage of stacking patrons on top of one another in getting the largest number of ticket buyers into a small space. Finally, the public theaters of Elizabethan England borrowed from the medieval staging practices of the earlier period. During the medieval period, plays were performed on a flat wagon that was rolled into a town square. Behind this flat wagon was another wagon on which a tent or a temporary structure was mounted for the actors to make their entrances and exits. The stage wagon was referred to as the platea. The scene house wagon was referred to as the mansion. Burbage took these basic ideas and built a raised stage which was backed by a stage house that was larger but similar in nature to the medieval mansion. These scene houses became more sophisticated as time went on. This scene house also had a balcony attached to it, which became a small but popular playing space. This was obviously in Shakespeare's mind when he wrote Romeo and Juliet. Well, it's now time for you to go to your task for this section. Next time, we will look at another unique physical theater that came into being during the Elizabethan period, referred to as the private theaters. We'll see you next time.
Now let us watch audio visual on private playhouses.
In the last section, we looked at the public theaters of Elizabethan England. The public theater structure of scene house and raised stage, which evolved from the medieval mansion, affected the way that plays were performed during this time period. The scene house, from which actors could make their entrances and exits, were a permanent part of the playhouse. There was also an upper section of the scene house that could be used for additional scenes, or from where musicians could perform during the play production. This arrangement made for little opportunity for scenery. There were some conventions that were used for scenery, like occasionally an actor would bring a limb of a tree on the stage to convey to the audience that the action occurred outdoors, or a banquet table was brought in from the stage house to indicate that the action was taking place in a banquet hall. The scene was most often set by what the characters were saying as they entered. If a character was commenting on the stormy weather that was approaching as he trotted along this rocky road, the audience knew that the scene that followed was out of doors. If the character commented on the aroma of the food cooking, the audience would then allow themselves to be transported into an Italian kitchen. It's often thought that this limitation forced Shakespeare and the other playwrights of the period to devise some of the most beautiful and descriptive language of any play, so as to allow the audience to use their imagination and create beautiful settings in their minds. While the public theaters were becoming very popular in London, their limitations caused the creator of the first permanent theatre of London, James Burbage, to consider building an indoor theatre. This led to the creation of the private theatres of Elizabethan England. Burbage was further induced to create a playhouse other than the theatre because he was embroiled in conflict with the landlord of the property on which the theatre was built. He learned that his landlord was planning to seize the property once the lease was up. So, he made arrangements to build a smaller version of the theatre inside a monastery. The monastery was inside the city limits of London, and, because it was under the jurisdiction of the Crown, the Puritans were unable to prevent its construction. The monastery was the Blackfriars, and, as was the custom, the monastery housed a school for boys. One of the activities of the educational program of a monastery school were public speeches, musical presentations, and recitations. It's likely that Burbage worked out an arrangement with the head of the monastery to build a theatre that the boys could use during the day and where his own play company could perform at night. While it's uncertain why these playhouses were referred to as private theatres, it's generally believed that because they were smaller, they needed to charge higher admission that was affordable only to the affluent. As a result, they functioned more like private clubs rather than a public facility such as the public playhouses or gaming arenas. They also differed from the public theaters in that they were constructed inside existing structures that had a roof. They were lit by candlelight or torches. They also had a stage and scene house like the public theaters, but they were much smaller and, in many cases, much more ornate. The most prominent private theatres were the Blackfriars, built by Burbage, and the Whitefriars, also a private theatre built inside a monastery. Other private theatres were built inside taverns and inns of locations within the city limits that were referred to as liberties. Like the monasteries, a few other locations within the city limits of London were either under the jurisdiction of the Crown or some nobleman and could not be restricted by the Puritans and other municipal authorities. Even though the locations themselves could not be restricted by the local authorities, the private theatres were troubled by their opponents' ability to restrict crowds from gathering outside the private theatres. As a result, the private theatres ultimately were used only by the boys' companies. The boys' companies were made up of the students of the monasteries. Because their theatre activities were tied to the monastery school, they did not meet with such resistance as did the adult companies that tried to perform in the private theatres. Shortly after James Burbage completed construction of the Blackfriars, he met with such resistance. It looked as though his race to secure a suitable replacement for his public playhouse would not occur, as the lease for the theater was running out. While in the process of locating land on which to build another theater, James Burbage died, leaving the theater and the Blackfriars to his sons Richard and Cuthbert. As legend has it, the Burbage sons, along with their company of actors, took down the theater board by board without the landlord's knowledge, and floated the woodwork from the dismantled structure across the Thames River to the south bank, where they leased some land. On this new property, they constructed a larger theater, and this is how the famous Globe Theater came into being. Well, it's time for your task for this section. When we come back, we'll continue our discussion of Elizabethan theater.
Now let us watch audio-visual on Playwrights. Here it is.
Elizabethan England produced some of the most influential and pioneering playwrights of the English-speaking language. William Shakespeare wrote during this period. It was a fertile field for the Elizabethan playwright. Even though there was much resistance by the local authorities, the plays and playhouses which surrounded the London city limits were immensely popular to the general public. The influence of the Italian Renaissance made accomplishment in art and learning the goal of every ambitious Londoner. The popularity of books supplied the playhouses with a literate public which raised the standard for the quality of their work. But the playwrights during this period also had to appeal to the lower classes that were not well educated. The challenge of appealing to this broad spectrum of potential audience members quickened the efforts of the playwrights of the Elizabethan England period and inspired them to write some of the greatest plays of all time. Perhaps the most lively and prolific group of playwrights to write for the theater at this time were referred to as the University Wits. The University Wits were a group of university-educated playwrights who were engaged in a friendly competition to outdo each other in the creation of plays based on the Senecan model. These men became celebrities around London, and their plays, while very highbrow, were very popular with all of the play-going public. Their plays often espoused ideals of the Italian Renaissance, and they tended to create three types of plays that became the staples of the Elizabethan stage. Such authors as John Lilly, Robert Greene, and Thomas Nash set the standard for playwriting in Elizabethan England. Perhaps the most prominent of the University Wits was Christopher Marlowe. Christopher Marlowe was admired during his lifetime for writing plays that were highly accomplished in their use of blank verse. We'll consider blank verse in our section on the iambic pentameter. Marlowe created villainous characters who had admirable qualities. Characters in such plays as The Jew of Malta, Tamburlaine, and Edward II shed the shackles of common morality to pursue their own personal ends. This made for very daring and breathtaking drama in its time. There were three types of plays in which Elizabethan playwrights excelled. These were the tragedies, the histories, and the comedies. The tragedies of Elizabethan England departed from the ancient Greek tragedies. They lacked the episodic structure and the attention that was paid to propriety. In this way, the Elizabethan playwrights were truer to their Roman counterpart Seneca. By his example, the Elizabethan playwrights excelled in what became known as the revenge tragedy. And perhaps no playwright achieved admiration and popularity more than the playwright Thomas Kyd for his revenge tragedy, the Spanish Tragedy. In Kyd's drama, there is much violence and deception. The scene in which the ghost of the lead character's father urges his son to avenge his untimely death spurred many imitators, including Shakespeare's Hamlet. The Elizabethans' thirst for vengeance and blood was often satisfied by the high number of revenge tragedies that were written and performed during this period. Another popular type of play that was common on the Elizabethan stage was the history play. The histories often celebrated some notable figure in English history and held up the admirable British traits of the character for the audience's delight. While the history plays were rarely accurate depictions of historical events, they often supplied their audience with a strong sense of pride and national good feeling. The comedies of Elizabethan England allowed the playwrights of England to excel at what they were educated to do: write poetry. While the comedies of this period were similar to today's comedies in that they were designed to make their audience laugh, what set the Elizabethan comedies apart is their extraordinary use of the emerging English language. The English language, as we know it, came into existence during the Elizabethan period. Many playwrights were also poets who elevated the English language to its poetic height. The comedies of this period were known as much for their beauty as for their ability to make the audience chuckle. The pastoral comedy was popular during this period and depicted simple, rural life with language that was meant to mirror the beauty of a natural countryside. Perhaps the most significant playwright of comedy during the Elizabethan period was Ben Jonson. Jonson was a university-trained playwright, but he did not associate himself with the university wits. He was fiercely independent and popular. His comedies focused on the dark side of human nature. His plays have often been referred to as the comedies of humors. Humors were considered overriding traits that individuals had depending on the humor that dominated their body. Jonson was best known for his comedies Every Man and His Humor, The Alchemist, and Bartholomew Fair. His play Volpone is a study in the comedy of humors and is often revived in professional productions today. Well, it's time again. Time to go to your task for this section. Once completed, we will continue our discussion of Elizabethan theater, including a look at the greatest playwright of all time. See you next time.
Now let us watch Shakespeare's Globe live here.
Hey, this is Mr. Sato, and I'm going to talk about Elizabethan theater. When people talk about Elizabethan theater, what they're usually talking about is William Shakespeare and the theater of his time. It's called Elizabethan because Queen Elizabeth I was the English monarch during the first part of Shakespeare's career. His plays were first performed between 1589 and 1613. London was separated by the River Thames from an area called Southwark. To American readers, these words look like Thames and Southwark, but that is not how they are pronounced. There was no bridge over the Thames at the time, and you had to pay a boatman to carry you across. Southwark wasn't included in the legal boundaries of the City of London, so London's laws didn't apply there. So naturally, people went there to do the things that they weren't allowed to do in London. It was what we'd now call the bad part of town. This painting by William Hogarth depicts Southwark about 100 years later, but it gives you an idea. There were taverns where people got drunk on beer and ale. There was gambling, prostitution, pickpockets, and other criminals, as well as a lot of animal cruelty that most people today would find barbaric, like cockfighting, which is where you get two roosters to fight each other to the death, and then you'd bet on one or the other to win. And also bear baiting. Bear baiting was when a captured bear, sometimes with its teeth pulled, was chained to a post and set upon by vicious dogs. The bear couldn't fight back very well, and people cheered on the dogs as they attacked and eventually killed it. It was cruel, and Shakespeare hated it. He referred to it more than once in his plays. Theater was another thing that was illegal in London. It wasn't the high-class art form we consider it today. It was considered common and crude compared with the poetry recitations, which the nobility preferred. So London theaters were closed in 1596 by the Church of England under the influence of the Puritans, who considered theater and practically everything else that wasn't praising God explicitly, immoral. But there was also the fear of bubonic plague, the Black Death. Large gatherings of people spread the disease. So as a result, putting on plays was literally against the law in London during much of this period. Shakespeare had to dismantle his theater board by board and rebuild it in Southwark. Shakespeare's theater was called the Globe. It was a round building. Shakespeare called it the Wooden O. Like a stadium, it was open air in the middle, with a thatched roof around. One thing they didn't have was artificial lighting, so all productions took place in the afternoon. The inside of the theater probably looks similar to this 1596 drawing of the Swan Theater, which was another theater in Southwark. Inside, there was an elevated stage, a balcony above. It was really the gallery over the back of the stage where audience members could be seated, or musicians. It had a cannon that could be fired for battle scenes. No cannonball, obviously, just the gunpowder. There were what are called flies, the area above the stage where a rope and pulley could be set up so an actor could be hoisted up into the air so that it looked like he was flying, as they would have done in The Tempest. There was at least one trapdoor in the floor of the stage so that an actor could jump down into it and appear to disappear or come out of it. In Hamlet, Hamlet would have jumped into Ophelia's grave, right? So that would be the trapdoor. There were no painted sets behind them. They just had tapestries back there. But Shakespeare employed what was called scene painting instead. That was where he would write it into a script, where a character like, say, Friar Lawrence in Romeo and Juliet would say, "Oh, look over there in the east where the sun is rising and there are streaks of yellow and red in the sky," or whatever. And that's how you knew that it was taking place at dawn. Or a character might come up to another and say, "Stranger, where am I?" And they would say, "Why, don't you know you're in Illyria," or whatever. And that's how you knew you were there. So that's what they would do instead of having elaborate painted sets like they would have later in theater history. There were a few set pieces, like in Romeo and Juliet, there was the tomb. In Macbeth, there would have been the banquet table, and so on. The pillars holding up the gallery / balcony could double as trees in a forest, like the Forest Arden in As You Like It. And because there were battle scenes and duels, they would have had armor, blunted swords, stage blood, music, and sound effects. So these plays, remember, they weren't just words on a page, they were living, breathing theater. Now, to advertise these shows, they raised a colored flag to tell people across the river what kind of play was being performed. A white flag meant they were putting on a comedy, like Midsummer Night's Dream. A red flag meant a history play, like Henry V. A black flag meant they were putting on a tragedy, like Romeo and Juliet or Othello. Upper and middle class audience members paid 2 pence for a seat, but they could pay up to 6 pence for the best seats. Poorer people paid just a penny to stand in front of the stage, exposed to weather. These poorer audience members were called groundlings. Vendors would walk around selling oranges, roasted hazelnuts, beer and cider, the way people today might buy hot dogs, peanuts, and soda at a baseball game. and the groundlings in particular would enjoy cheering when the hero entered and booing the bad guy, occasionally even throwing things at the actors when they didn't like what they were seeing up there. The groundlings could get a little restless at times, so lucky for us, Shakespeare always broke up long stretches of talking with things like a sword fight, a comical buffoon, or a few dirty jokes. This next fact freaks out a lot of my students when they first hear it. But female roles were played by adolescent boys wearing platform shoes and wigs and long dresses, and I'm guessing a lot of makeup to make them look like women. Remember that theater was considered crude and common, totally inappropriate for the supposedly more delicate sensibilities of women. In fact, middle or upper-class women who merely attended these plays actually sometimes wore masks so they wouldn't be recognized. So women were definitely not allowed to be on stage, being looked at by crowds of strange men. That was explicitly against the law. But despite what you may see in movie versions of these plays, I don't think there was a lot of kissing in these plays during that time. Read the plays. The love scenes are all verbal, oratorical. Today, William Shakespeare is widely regarded as the greatest writer in the English language. Once beginning readers get used to the 400-year-old language, they often discover that his plays are really very beautiful, but also exciting, funny, suspenseful, and overall a lot of fun. So, enjoy.
Now let us move on to the next segment. Thank you.